guess this is like...
Right, are all good? Everybody sitting comfortable? Good. Right, well, thank you very much for coming tonight. It's good to see you. Just in case you forget to take notes, we're going to share this online. We're filming everything and anything, so you can, if we are particularly insightful, fingers crossed, you can share it with your colleagues and friends from Monday. So my name is Sara Seravalli. I'm the host of, well, the owner of Il Salotto. It's all about sharing knowledge and inspiration and ideas so that through good architecture and good design we can actually make a difference. So I'm very grateful for Anthony Newman from MLA, Rob Morrison from Best, and Cristobal from Page Park to be here with me tonight and talk about retrofitting. So the funny thing is, when we had our first conversation about this panel, and then you were talking about what kind of angles we were going to discuss, in my ignorance, I said, oh, can we not talk about how you put an air source pump in a castle? And you said, Sarah, that's renovation, is not retrofitting. So, Tony, what's retrofitting? Pretend there is a lot of Sarahs in the audience and not actually people that know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I suppose the key thing, we think about renovations and we
Yep.
think about retrofitting. Renovations primarily are, if you take something that's needing repair, if you take a castle, for example, and needs repair, you need to make it fit for your purpose to keep the water out, and you maybe need to live in it in a certain way, so you make renovations to it to try and encapsulate yourself in a building and make it work for you there and then. But retrofit is more about trying to meet our net zero targets.
Yep.
It's taking the step beyond. So if you've got your old castle, how can we stop using the big fireplace with all the fossil fuels coming out of the chimney, for example? How do you reach the net zero targets? So it's mainly to do with net zero targets in the cities that we live in and the buildings that we use. So within the Scottish Government framework, we were trying to reach a target in 2035
Yep.
to reach net zero. That's now been shifted to 2045, and the UK target is 2050. Regardless of all of that, to meet the net zero targets, there's been an estimate done to actually looking at existing building stock. So when we think about retrofitting, it's this building, it's every building in the city, whether it's from 2008 or 1908, and making it more energy efficient, making it more compliant and making it better to use. So to actually get everything up to standard by 2050, we would need to be doing 5% more retrofitting projects every year to actually get anywhere close to reaching net zero targets. Is one of the key things. So within retrofitting, there's the UK GBC, which is the UK Green Building Council.
Yep.
They have definitions on retrofitting. They have light and deep retrofitting. Light is probably about performance optimization. So if you maybe have some mechanical systems, you have lighting, you have some ventilation, you maybe have leaky windows, what can you do to do a very basic light touch to get the building a bit more thermally efficient, energy efficient? Deep is more when you take an entire building and you start looking at, well, where's the issues in it? Where's the insulation lacking? Where's the air going out through cracks in the walls? And then also taking things like gas-fired boilers and things like that and replacing them with fully electric, and starting to plug the building into the energy efficient network that the government and the country is trying to create by using renewable energy, etc. And that's in electricity, it's not through fossil fuels. So retrofit is that rather than just renovating and making it work.
Anna, you are, throughout your career, worked a lot with actually much older buildings, and you're now heavily involved also with all the work that your ex-colleague Karen Pickering is doing with the university in Edinburgh. So there we are talking about buildings that are not 40, 50 years old, are buildings that are 100 years old, but we are still So net zero target is one element, but then the other could be also get those buildings ready for the next 50 years. So how do you make such an old building works in terms of space and use of the space so that we don't need to renovate a university building again in 10 years?
It's funny because actually the Victorian buildings like this one are actually in a very good condition, and the fabric is good. They were built to last, and they use good materials, and most of the time on those type of buildings, all you really have to do is unpeel the amount of things that have been happening to them through the decades of, you know, false ceilings and plasterboard on the walls and that kind of thing. And once you've unpeeled them, you can then start letting them breathe again, and understanding the fabric and how those buildings were put together is actually quite important in terms of enhancing the performance of the buildings energetically, and also understanding what the consequences are. Because in a new building, if you're going to have a very high level of air tightness, it's okay because you're creating like permeable air going in and out in a much more controlled environment. The old Victorian buildings actually breathe, like they use the skin as a breathing element, and it then becomes quite problematic when you make it really close, and so that's one thing that you have to be careful about. The other thing is that if it's always interesting with existing in older buildings that they tended to be quite generous. They were generous in height, they were generous in circulation, they were generous in how the Victorians really understood how light worked and how movement worked. And so once you've unpeeled them, you kind of create these boxes where activity can take place. And it's always, I suppose the most difficult part always is how do you move power across these spaces, and how do you make them, how do you can fit into it, because they don't tend to have raised floors, and if you put raised floors, you're kind of changing the proportion of that. So when we were doing the restoration of the MAC, for instance, we had this big intense work on how we were going to take all the cables, because we didn't want to get any surface mounted things. But that's the Victorians. I suppose the other thing that is interesting is the 60s buildings, and these are now coming into the retrofit world in lots of institutions, both in education but also in commercially. And some of them are not listed, some others are. I think there is this kind of still this trying to decide how do you deal with those buildings, and do you want them to keep the way they are. It's a good strategy there for some buildings during the 90s, and they noticed that they were just recladding them with something important just to enhance that. And then again, they are quite good because they tend to be quite good bones and quite good structure, so you can be quite flexible how things are put together. But the more listed buildings, the more of these 60s become listed, the more careful we have to be about how do you actually deal with the cladding. And we're having to then imagine whether do you take the cladding away, you put the insulation behind, do you actually put it inside and avoid the cold breaching. But I think the other thing that is important, and this is all technical stuff that you kind of have to do, there is something really useful about how do you create environments that last for the future, and that is the same whether it's a new building or an existing building. And it's talking with the users about how they're going to be doing what they want to do and what are the things that mostly they cannot do at the moment, and try to think about challenging them to think about things that they haven't thought about yet, that you could do this. Oh, actually, maybe we could. What do we need to do? And it's trying to create paths and places to be able to move and move across. So I think people are a really important part of how do you actually deal with these buildings to be ready for the future, and understanding what the performances are and what their activities is and what their missions are as well.
Sorry, I'm jumping back to you before I go to Rob. Tony, I am a big fan of old buildings, not so much of 60s, 70s and 80s architecture. So when is it worth keeping the building and retrofitting, and when can we actually just knock it down and build something better?
You know, that's an interesting thing. I'm talking about the 60s buildings, 70s and 80s buildings, 30-year period there. You get a lot of office buildings that are there that have quite mean floor-to-ceiling compared to the Victorian example. That you've got 3 meters of space, you've got next to nothing, and these were offices that were designed for like factories for working in almost. They've actually got quite poor ventilation standards and quite poor light standards, and when we might come across a project to look at one of these buildings, do an evaluation on it, you might turn around to your client and say,
nah,
Well, you might say actually it's not going to work as an office building because it's not going to sell, it's not going to rent because people are not going to work in this space because it feels like you're in a shoebox. So maybe you should look at a hotel, maybe you should look at something residential within that. We had a project, Meldrum House in Edinburgh, where it was an office block, 60s office block in the West End. Does not fit in whatsoever with the nice, the older buildings of the area. So we said, well actually, where's the embodied carbon in this building? What's the parts that are worth keeping? So in terms of when you look at embodied carbon, that's how much energy is required to actually construct something. So a piece of concrete or a column has had X amount of energy to produce that, and then that energy is there for a fixed amount of time. It will take a long time of use before that goes down to zero again. Structure, with huge amounts of concrete, with the rebar that's inside them, there's a huge amount of embodied carbon, and if you're to construct something nowadays, a new build, the structure is the most expensive thing. So we would say, let's look at the structure and what you can keep. So generally when you get a building, first thing you say, well, can we reuse and repurpose it? And then the second thing, and if you're like, well actually that's not going to work for us, we might actually, can we remove parts of the building? What's the parts that have any kind of value, and maybe regenerate around that? And there's schemes where you might keep the concrete frame and work around that. Sometimes, and I've been working on a project up at Charing Cross beside the train station there, that there's 60s office blocks, they're set back from the street, they don't contribute positively to the city, and that's the thing when you get a building, you have to look at where does it sit in its environment. Where's the sun? Where's the prevailing wind? Where are the views? And
how did the heck did they get planning permission?
How does it go? Well, it was through a concept.
Yeah.
Whereas now our understanding of how a city works is how you are as a human being. Like what makes you feel safe? What feels good outside of where we are right now feels good when you're on the street. The building makes the street edge. Whereas if you take a 60s development in Charing Cross, it's set back from the street. It's car dominated. It's about the motorway. It creates environments that turned out to actually be quite negative as a human being. And we were saying it's really going to be a big struggle to make this work. So actually at that point, it's going to be better to take the structure away and perhaps put something back. You're retrofitting the city in a sense, but you're not retrofitting the building. But when you're doing that, you can look at recycling anything. Is there opportunities to find parts of that building? For example, you can take all the glass off a building now, you can send that back to the glass manufacturers, they can melt it down and reuse it. Is there parts of the concrete you could keep on site, or you can actually use it as your mix for anything new that you build. There's lots of hurdles and technical challenges to make that work, but yeah, just step by step. An old building like this one, you just look at it and it's got an architectural presence that you just sort of, you enjoy, that there might be things internally that just don't work. So when things like that, not this one exactly, but you might say, well, we need to keep half of that structure, but we'll change one of the walls to the rear or things like that.
I'm actually going to see Meldrum House for the Hera Property Awards.
Right.
So, Rob, what is the role of Retrofit Scotland? How is Retrofit Scotland supporting all this work that Scotland needs to do about retrofitting?
So my role is I'm impact manager with BEST, which is Built Environment Smarter Transformation, and I work in the retrofit team. And before I joined BEST, my background was I was exec director of a social enterprise, and we were retrofitting old industrial buildings up by the canal. We were discussing it earlier, and I think just very briefly on that point, I think what I learned through that process is like ultimately these buildings in Glasgow were exactly to your point around the value of these buildings that are inherently built with incredible, robust materials, but also spaces that are inherently adaptable. And I think ultimately, I think that we're losing that within architecture with the over-specification of both building spaces and the materials that we put within them. So there's a consideration there back to Tony's point about how things can be recycled, because that's increasingly hard as we get more and more specified. And like just look at all the things that everything's like bonded and laminated, and it's much harder to kind of reuse. But from Retrofit Scotland's perspective, I joined BEST to sort of really think about what is the learning that can be taken from from a very localized approach, working hyper-local in an area for 11, 12 years, and then what can be taken from that and then thought about how that can be scaled to what are the learnings that can then be taken to other parts of the country. And ultimately it's recognizing that the challenge is very context specific. The challenge is incredibly nuanced based on the context, in terms of the city, the place, what is the architecture, the materials that are used, and also ultimately what is the social context. I think with the thing that we always forget, I think as architects, is we often look at the challenge through an architectural lens, and not necessarily it is the people who inhabit spaces that make them both active, used, and vibrant, thriving, and contributing factors to our cities.
Totally.
So that's a very long-winded preamble. But I think it's important. I guess what I'm trying to say is, you asked me about what is the role of Retrofit Scotland. I'm a very practical person. I've come from a very specific context. And what Retrofit Scotland aims to do, I'm working with the team at Best there, and it does 4 things. So one is around training. So we're developing retrofit training. We've been doing that for the last 5 years. We have a space out in... has anyone been to the Best HQ?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, nice. So we've got a space out in Hamilton, and so we're building Scotland's National Retrofit Centre there. That's been funded via Scottish Government SALEX to create an environment for training. So we'll have...
Training who exactly? Anybody? Can I come?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Come. Yeah, absolutely. So it's like a mix. So basically we have like different audience segments. So like one training is around like supporting, we're about to launch a program called the Low Carbon Passport. So that's working with tier 1 contractors, working with their operatives and then their supply chain in terms of their subcontractors to upskill about low carbon construction techniques. So that's going to be an 18-month program, and we have to deliver 1,200 training places. So that's looking at things like natural materials, also like both passive house principles, NFIT principles, and like thinking about how we train people in regards to construction skills. But that's also, it'll be open to designers, architects.
Well, I'm neither, so maybe not for me. Okay, then.
No, it's not exclusive. It's not exclusive. And then, so that's training, and then we're convening, so we're running events. We're running Best Fest in November, which is a conference that we organise. We're building a network of spaces. So the one in Hamilton, the glue factory in Glasgow is going to be retrofit as a retrofit training centre. And then the final thing is about a knowledge hub. So we're working with, there's a very ambitious project called the Centre for Net Zero High Density Buildings. It's ambitious, both in ambition but also the amount of words.
Yeah.
That's a bit of a mouthful, but it's a four-year project run by the University of Edinburgh, and that's like looking at how we can share knowledge about retrofitting at scale.
Yeah.
So Retrofit Scotland will be a platform to share case studies. So pooling, there's over 140 case studies that already exist, so putting them into one platform so we can learn both from the successes but also the challenges. And then it will develop like supply chain mapping. So basically starting to understand from a Scottish perspective, so we're not always we're learning from both the successes and the challenges and the mistakes. So yes, those 4 things is what we're going to be working on over the next 12 months.
Why did you say it's increasingly difficult to reuse and recycle? Because I'm actually noticed the opposite. There's many more of the companies that work with us that actually offer reuse and recycle. If nobody has, our new furniture partner here, Saxon, is the second largest office furniture refurbishers in the UK.
Mm. So
there is actually many more suppliers that are making the extra effort to come and meet you guys and work there.
So I think this is my opinion. So this is not founded upon any sort of I've never delivered a sort of. There's a lot of projects that try and recycle building components. I've tried to do it, and it is very, very difficult because there's an inherent cost and. In terms of just the storage and the de-store, and like you have to figure out what you do with it, short and long term. But I think what I meant, so there's one thing which is the challenge because like programs are often incredibly tight, and you have to figure out quite quickly what to do with it. But that's just my experience. There's also something, just if you just look around, I guess like what I meant was like historically with more traditional buildings, like you have like just materials in their natural state, timber, plaster, like stone, And whereas now a lot of materials, if you look around, like, a lot of them are synthetic and bonded to achieve like additional performance values. And I think that's when it becomes much harder to recycle, because you have to sort of like separate things. You have to sort of like inherently, as become more specified, they become more challenging.
So we go back to the Victorians, they knew how to build buildings better.
Potentially. I mean, there's learnings to be said. It's like you can go all the way back to kind of like buildings that were built just with very vernacular buildings that are just sort of like put together with the materials at hand. And I think we're getting better, because the whole life cycle of materials and buildings is being better understood. But I think there was really a period where that just was not a consideration, and just things were just getting compressed.
Yeah, but that's what I mean. I've noticed now a shift, because I've mentioned the office furniture, but then another client of ours, Solus, they now can create a terrazzo out of rubble and glass, and you know, you take off the facade from a building and it comes back as a terrazzo worktop. So there is so many more companies now that are putting extra effort in coming with ideas to allow you to recycle material. If nothing else, your colleague Garth in the beautiful Rosebank distillery, he forced the bricklayers to clean all the single bricks and pieces of timber so that he could reuse them in the building, and it's absolutely stunning.
I suppose the difference on what you were saying is during the 80s and the 90s, nobody was building for a life expectancy of more than 50 years. And that included the skin of the building. And because at that point is where synthetic, plastic-based materials started to come in fashion. It's like asbestos, you know. Now we know asbestos is terrible. At that time in the 70s, that was like the godsend, and now we know the consequences, and you wouldn't be able. So I think there was this phase in between the 80s, 90s, noughties, that nothing was built to last. It was just built to shine, and also the performance. And now we went through this phase of materials that were very good to energetically perform, but actually nobody really realized that it was costing the planet another thing by doing them. And the more glue and plastic things have, the more difficult it is to recycle. And we're just getting towards that. And materials in a building, like the concrete or the steel and the structures, you can't take them apart because it is a man-made thing, but you have to then retest them, and they need to be recertified, and it's taking a bit to time to get this process organized. I mean, the ideas are there, but to get it going, it's just a bit clunky still.
Totally.
I think it's a whole re-education sort of process. I think with material suppliers and furniture suppliers, they have the ability to quickly react to the market. Whereas when you're dealing with the whole fabric of a building, so I've had a number of projects recently where we've been looking at buildings in the 90s and noughties for commercial clients, big office blocks with aluminium framed curtain walling with lots of glass. So now with better energy standards, we're like, well, we need to insulate better. We've got too much glass, we've got solar overheating, and in winter we've got too much heat being lost. So we're looking at ways, well, can we increase the amount of solid on the facade, and can we triple glaze, for example. So we had a project where building was actually in a reasonable condition. There was issues with the way things were detailed and to do with airtightness and insulation values, and the client would like to increase the thermal efficiency of the building, so then they can change the building to electric heating and cooling, etc. There's a really good, so the back box is the part of the curtain wall that attaches to the structural frame or to the slab of a building, and the back box holds your glass, and then in front of the glass you put a cap on and it holds the whole thing together. So when you come to refurbishing it, you take double glazed pane out, which in the 90s was the best they had. Now with new manufacturing methods, with triple glazing and all the good stuff, we can put something better on that. And when you look at the system, the actual frame, the aluminium frame, there's nothing wrong with it at all. But for someone who owns the building, they want a warranty and a guarantee that they're going to get another 25 years out of it. So if a bank comes and rents that floor space, they're not going to turn around to them and say, oh, there's water coming in the facade, you're going to have to fix it for us. If the person, the landlord, owns a building, they want someone they can go back to. So a lot of people in the bricks and mortar side of construction at the moment, they're like, we'll supply you the glass, no problem, we'll supply you that. It'll all work, we'll put it in, it won't leak, but we're not going to do a warranty for it. So there's a risk there, whereas the furniture suppliers, etc., are they're much more flexible and they're working with people and listening. And I think it's a funny one looking at the facades, for example. You take an old building, you assume you don't assume, you get a structural engineer to check, but the structure is in good condition and it's second hand, and you're quite happy to use that structure again second hand. There's a strange kind of dislocation in people's minds that, well, the glass and the curtain and the wall, I wouldn't want that second hand, or the roof, but there's a gradual place that we need to get to where we use that. And then the other thing with materials, we were working with Buchanan Galleries for 5 years looking at how to redevelop that whole area, looking at a shopping centre. That shopping centre was designed purely for retail, so floor-to-floor heights were bespoke and specific to the retailer that was going in there, for escalators, for light and street levels. So floors are all over the place. It was all solid construction, and we went through a big process of how we could recycle it and reuse it. It was a big challenge to find other uses for it, because you've got there's escapes and rat runs and things like that. It's like turning a stadium into someone's house. It's a big challenge. Ultimately, we got to a point where we were going to have to take parts of the building down. The challenge at that point, there was lots of good stuff there. There was lots of good concrete, there was good tiles. If they take that all down, one of the biggest buildings in the city, where can you put that stuff in the intermediate term?
Yeah.
It could then be reused. It could be reused on the new buildings, it could be used for street furniture, it could be reused, or it could be sold to someone else. There's no one in the market right now that is holding that material. You've got demolition companies who take stuff and grind it up and will get aggregates back out of concrete and things and sell it and things. But if you want to keep a brick as a brick, there's no big bit of land. It takes land, it takes space to hold those.
Definitely not in the city centre of Glasgow, that's for sure.
Yeah, so that's the challenge. And the more you move it away from where you're sourced, and this comes back to,
and then you go back to adding
it's like
carbon.
It all gets shipped down to Sheffield,
and
then
I need to bring it back.
And then in 2 years' time, someone's doing a project in Glasgow and is like, I need that stuff back, so then it's all shipped back up again, and that's the challenge.
It is massive.
So when does your heart sing? You know, one of the things we talked about is a building that tells you the story and where it wants to go. Well, some buildings just don't tell you anything, you just knock it down. Anna, how do you identify the building that is guiding you?
Every building makes you sing.
Right.
Wow.
I think so. I think you can find good things in everything, really.
You're an optimist.
I am a well-informed optimist. I think though it's interesting because in our practice, I think we were doing some numbers the other day, and 75% of the projects we work on is in existing buildings or existing contexts. I don't think we've done a new build that hasn't been housing for a long time. And it's all we try to always, you know, work and work with things that are there. And even the ugly ducklings there's always something good that you can find on them. So it's the challenge, I suppose, that makes me sing rather than the building. Of course, the buildings that are beautiful, you know. Roslyn Castle was an amazing project to work on. It doesn't get more atmospheric or more Scottish than that, you know, the glen, the view, you know, the deers running up. And
sorry, I've got a site visit.
Beautiful new room, you know, like all the water, the pumps underneath as well in what it used to be the jail. It's beautiful, and but it was also making us sing because it was extremely difficult to build from many aspects, from it being a scheduled monument to the logistics of actually getting stuff into the valley to all the other things. And that was a beautiful building. But, you know, we look at buildings that are 60s, 70s, that are ugly ducklings, that people consider ugly ducklings, and we think, yeah, we can do things with it. They have the height already. You know, they have things on it that you will not be able to put back in, and it's like, how do you make it? The views are incredible. You know, you can always find something, unless it's just like really crumbling, or maybe an 80s building will not make me sing.
We got there eventually.
Maybe an 80s office block in Madrid with like reflecting glass. I might struggle, but I think we'll find something to make it good. But it's fine because it's you know, you were touching earlier, Anthony, about how buildings touch the ground and how there is always something that you can do better at that age that normally people don't think about. And how do you extend the building inside, and how does it connect to its neighbors? And there is always something you can do better. Even in the 80s glassy block building that was on my way to university that I wanted to bomb every time I passed through it. Yeah, so yeah, I think I will find something nice.
I would happily bomb my old 1985 house.
There you go. So you see.
Rob, talking about generally, what do you think are the main barriers and challenges about our target and pushing retrofitting harder in Scotland?
I think that the challenge is that we've kind of designed those programs of work around some of those challenges as we understand them, like training, building community, physical spaces, and sharing of knowledge. So I think that they are areas that I think definitely need to be worked on. I think actually one of the and it's quite a very unsexy topic, but like one of the things that I've been thinking more and more about is just the ultimate challenges around like procurement. And like some of the really just really basic stuff, procurement, business rates, VAT, like it's actually not the sort of sexy stuff. We talk a lot about as designers of like what all this stuff looks like, but actually it's that so much is about the system that is this work is being delivered within, and that's actually the levers at play if you add in policy and funding. But like there's like if you just put aside like there's really talented people, really ambitious projects that happen, and then you put the system that sits within is actually the thing that I think government and policymakers have levers of power. Those are things that are relatively simple. Like you can change, like you can develop policy. That's probably the cheapest way. Like if you want to make one lever that's relatively affordable to do from government before you put any funding in, that's a lever you could pull. Put decisions around like the monetary frameworks and VAT. VAT
is a massive thing.
Like, the empty building rates. Yeah. Like people are pulling down buildings just because they can't afford the rates. Like, and so like these are amazing buildings that are never going to get rebuilt again. So these are basic things that at government level, if they're really serious about like these targets, they're things that they could do quite quickly to sort of like level the playing field in favour of retrofit over
knock it down
and start again. And I think I really agree with what you're saying. I think the big one as well is like the buildings tell a story, and I think we have to be clear that we are like at the end of the day we can sit within the construction industry, but ultimately we are part of a society that has stories to tell, and Glasgow has like a very rich, nuanced, proud heritage. And if we lose the buildings that that are in contention here, then there's a massive loss because they just don't come back, and then we lose a lot more than like the carbon or the square meterage.
You lose the identity of the city.
Yeah, it's massive, and I think like that's like so those sort of like four things that I mentioned at sort of governmental level. If they're areas that can be sort of like tweaked without much. I mean, I don't know the economics specifically, but like
I totally agree about the VAT, because the only way you can get a zero VAT is if you are refurbishing a building that is for dwellings exclusively, or is for a charity.
Yeah.
So if that was something that applied to other types of retrofitting, renovation, refurbishment, whatever you want to do it, the contractors will make more money. It will be the risk that they take when they take an existing building is major. So it just makes everything more expensive because nobody wants to take the risk. So the VAT reduction will help with actually making those more attractive to people, and I think we should campaign for that. And as a matter of fact, we are.
Yeah. But nobody, that's the problem is that everybody wants to like. It's not a very like exciting topic.
But it is because it's
but it's crucial.
It's crucial. But it's like, it's massive. But it's like it's one of those things that it's
Yeah, we all sit here. There was a breakfast panel discussion organised by the Herald. And it was about city living and Glasgow City and how important it is to repopulate the city centre. And that's actually a topic that came up,
of course,
at that level as well. You know, as you say, empty buildings, why do you not incentivise the reuse and repurpose and...
seriously, like
it's just one of those black and white bits of policy, like the empty building business rates. So if you take a listed building, it goes on the market, someone wants to buy it, and they want to do good with it. They want to turn it into something good, but to do good with it, you need a bit of time to think about it and work out what to do with it. It makes it empty while you're
For a
doing
while.
that,
Mhm.
but they'll be paying 20 grand a month or
Yes, wow.
200
Or
grand
more.
a month. Crazy amounts of money they have to pay on that empty building. So they'll be like, let's just knock it down. Because we can knock it down.
And take all the time you want to
we
build.
we can build it with 0% VAT. We can
Yeah.
get all these cuts. So what's the point in keeping that building there? And that's what we lose, the history, the culture in our cities if we go down that route. And it's about speed, and legislation is just too quick to respond because we are losing buildings fairly rapidly across Glasgow even to this. And I'll sit down with developers continuously who we will be pushing to reuse the building, but they also want to reuse the building, but they also have targets and money to make.
Yeah.
And nobody's actually really in construction when well, maybe we are, but you're not completely in construction just for charity. People, but contractors, they're there to make money. Developers are there to make money on it. That's their business, but their business can contribute to
No, we are
society.
all here to make money, but we
Yeah.
could also be socially responsible while doing so. Yes, Dave.
Sorry to interrupt. I cover the whole of the UK, and we're working with a client in Manchester
Capital and centric.
that are actually going around these old buildings and multi-storey car parks from the 60s and 70s and repurposing those buildings. Now, I agree exactly what you just said there. They don't do it for free. They hit the various marks that the council wants to hit for them as well. But that is one group that I've never seen before, but they are actually doing that kind of work now.
Yeah, I'm desperate to get Tim Hitley on the stage, but it's proving hard man to pin down. But I'm on the case, so bear with me, and we can join forces then. Right, so here in Il Salotto, we like collaboration, right? We like joint forces, we like working together and sharing ideas and inspire one another. So what's the dream team when it comes to retrofit? Tony?
Okay, well, you've got your typical consultants that are on any kind of construction, your structural engineers, your mechanical and electrical consultants, your architects, interior designers. I think the extra things that you get with doing a retrofit is sustainability. So someone who specialises in sustainability, who can calculate the embodied carbon targets. There's the REBA 2030 challenge where you're trying to get embodied carbon down below 750 kilograms of CO2 per metre squared of embodied carbon.
Whatever that means.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can't believe you remember that number, but
It's a challenge because the amount of charts,
It's really small.
the amount of charts that you make to try and meet that target is really difficult to get close to it. So sustainability consultant can guide you through that and help you with that. The other thing when I was talking about reuse, there are consultants out there that will go down buildings and quantify absolutely everything in that building, the structure as well as the floor tiles, the furniture in it, the light fittings, and they will know where that can go. And that's only going to grow over time, that market. More and more people are joining connections, starting to get experience of it. It's difficult at first, but once you build up a database of it, you can almost see these as like the new quantities of areas of the future that just have, you just know where to go. You just know where all those light fittings can go. You know how to get them reused or recycled. And then I think it's also really like looking at something like BEST. It's where, if there was opportunity to have a material bank of things, if you could get a team, if you could get somewhere that you could go, and it's a big, the Amazon of building products, of vintage of buildings, that you could get the stuff you need, because it's there, and it's in our cities, a lot of stuff that we need to build stuff.
we've got one for furniture.
Yeah.
I think you also need a client that wants to do good things and that is not
So
afraid.
what's the resistance? Why would the client not say?
I think I was just gonna go into that. I think is dealing with existing buildings inherently has risks, and you need a client with a strong view of where they want to go, and being informed and being able to actually value what the risks are and what the gains are at the end. Your client is interested in terms of going around, looking at car parks and converting it into places which is amazing. I knew that was happening in London. I didn't realize they were going into Manchester.
Yeah,
Maybe they're coming here next. That will be brilliant.
Well, we are trying. We are on the case.
But I think risk is the really important thing here for clients and developers and contractors, because you never know what you're going to find in an existing building. Never, no matter how many resurveys you've done, how many underground surveys you have done, there is always something. And that is a risk. And therefore, you need a client that is willing to take that risk, and a good team that actually can minimize the risk, or that knows what the risks are, and then say, okay, are we going to do this? And yes, this is the risk. We can measure it, we can contain it, but it's crucial to have a client that has a vision and the ability to take those risks. And not everybody can, that's the other thing, not everybody can. And so...
As in financially?
As in financially, and whatever it means, because it could be delays. It could be money, but it could also be delays. It could be planning. It could be warrants. It could be lots of things that are much more complex and more risky when you are dealing with an existing building than what you would do with a new one. And that's going back to your policy thing. You know, we need a system that makes that as easy to deal with as what you would with a new one. And that's very complicated because it just requires a different type of skill.
I think part of the team as well is the suppliers, and it is.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Which does come back to your client willing you to talk to people like Cristobal. You were talking about recycling materials. My challenge working with that is I was working on buildings in the 90s that were all aluminium, and there was nothing.
Nothing you can just a wee tiny bit.
So there's things like that, and manufacturers who are willing to experiment.
Well, you need vision, don't you?
Yeah, because it is the future. If someone can see there's a market there in the future, it's the people that are there first that are going to...
But even if you don't just look at the market and then the financial benefit of it, you still need the visionary that say, right, let's do it. We need to push the boundaries harder. Yeah. Have you got any questions before I carry on with mine?
Of course. I was just going to ask, there's a new policy come out for Glasgow City Council where they've allowed or going to allow tall buildings to kind of change the skyline of Glasgow. Just wondered how the panel for given that we just talked about retrofitting, that the council have agreed to allow it to be a tall buildings.
So that policy, there was never a policy that didn't allow tall buildings.
No.
That policy basically gives a slightly more, it's not quite prescriptive, but a prescriptive approach that allows someone who wants to build a tall building a bit more certainty in what they need to do to make it a successful tall building. So like I was talking about Charing Cross earlier, we were looking at the Seafoot Partners project up there, and you were talking about when's like an ugly building and interesting. That building's really interesting. It's got these amazing precast facade panels that are load bearing. Which makes it a challenge to reuse because it's like designed to like the maximum it can take, and it's quite experimental. So we looked at that whole building and how to reuse it to make a positive impact on the city, and this is the key thing with retrofit as well. You go through stages, and it is about nuance as well and kind of looking what's there. We've ended up with a 26-storey tower on it, which will be one of the tallest in the city once it's done. I don't think retrofit and tall buildings contradict each other because there are opportunities where you need to retrofit and there are things that can be reused, but sometimes there's a point where it's not sustainable actually to make it work, and it's difficult to make it work, and maybe look at the social impacts of space as well. Those are answers that as such.
Anna, what are you thinking?
I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. Like this. I suppose the bit that is unbalanced there is that it's still easier to build new than to build in and retrofit or extend something. And until policies change to make it equally easy, then people will go for the easy way because that's what it is. And the tall building policy makes that extending upwards easier if it's new than if it's going to be over an existing thing. So to me, it's not so much the fact that they are trying to get some guidance and framework to how you build taller in the city. So I think that's okay. I think it's the fact that they're not doing enough to make the existing buildings and the refurbishment of that easily achievable as well, because that will actually increase the appetite for it from the commercial point of view. I don't have a problem with tall buildings per se, if they're well designed and that they're nice to their neighbors, and if they take care of the wind that happens underneath, and all that.
They don't melt the cars that
all
are
these
at the bottom
kind of
street.
things that you have to do, but it's about good architecture, isn't it, and a good placemaking, and then there is beautiful towers out there and beautiful pieces of city that are like that. So that's
actually, a roof extension on a Victorian building is actually such an interesting.
Exactly. You just have to know. It's all about good design and good answers and the policies that makes it easier to build new.
Yeah, I think I don't know about the policy personally, because I'm not in the business of designing buildings, but well, not like these guys are in terms of they're actual architects. I'm just sort of a recovering architect of sorts.
You're probably better.
Yeah, Tony and I, we studied together, so we've gone on quite different paths. But I think that idea of I think the thing about retrofit, I think that often we don't talk enough about is ultimately there's the sort of it comes back to your original question. It's about definition. I think everyone will have their own definition of what we're talking about here. Mine's maybe actually slightly different from Tony's, but that's fine. I think that one of the really, really important things within Glasgow is about ultimately what does the city want to be, and what is it as a place to both live and work, socialise and do all the things as a function of a city. And I think if there are vacant sites in the city centre, then we should densify those as much as possible, because through that densification we then maximise the use and the utility of the city, and that brings people footfall. And if you just think we've got a massive problem in regards to, my projects historically were looking at the repurposing and reusing of post-industrial buildings. We are still struggling to overcome the challenges of a city that has gone through a deindustrialization process. It's too big for the inhabitants. And I think if we really think about that as a problem, then one of the solutions is reducing sprawl and making it much more dense. And in doing so, we will then start to bring people and different use types. Think about Sucky Hall Street. It's we have to be pretty. We need to be creative about it. And I think and you think about my point was really that we're still struggling with the deindustrialization of our city. The next one is around the decommercialization in terms of shopping is changing dramatically. And so what does that mean when we've built a city around, if you think about this area, you walk down Argyle Street, what does it look like above street level? Even we're struggling at street level, let alone above, all the stories above. So I think if we're densifying the city, that's positive in my opinion.
Can I just link in to that and say, instead of going to the singular policy, can we not talk about what's the vision for the city or for the country, so that, but not a 5-year vision, a 20, 30, 40-year vision, so that when we build a new building, it doesn't interfere with something that is already there. So every time it drives me nuts. Every time I drive up the Kingston Bridge, and all of a sudden I can't see the hydro there anymore. I say, why would you spend so much money working with Norman Foster, and then you put these horrendous buildings in front of it that nobody can see anymore? So can we not work with sort of vision, so that the identity of the city is preserved and enhanced, rather than just focus, okay, we need more flats, or we need more offices, or...
It's completely true, and this is a big challenge for the whole of Scotland at the moment. There's not a clear, what is Scotland, what's the economy, why do you come here, why do you invest, what kind of business do you do, where's the growth? A lot of the commercial clients that we work with are very, very reactive right now. So the biggest thing is purpose-built student accommodation, more than offices, more than residential. That's the one thing right now that they can make money on. A few years ago, those hotels, you've got traditional office developers that are they try to do the formula that they've always used.
And it doesn't work.
And that's why developers like you were mentioning are really interesting, and they're going to be, fresh eyes is a really good thing. But yeah, the vision, because then because ultimately buildings cost a lot of money.
Yeah.
They cost a lot of money within our environment, and we don't really have a strong enough economy to support that with with their own wealth, and there's a lot of wealth needs to come from abroad to finance that.
Yeah.
And we need to get returns on the buildings, and a lot of our city is owned by pension funds abroad, and at home, for example, there needs to be a reason that everyone globally knows why to come to Glasgow.
Yeah.
Is it our music scene? Is it our art scene? Is it
The events
is it sports
that-
and events? We always just seem to jump from one to the other and say we're really good at them, and we are really good at them, but then we all get really depressed about state payments and stuff like that. But it's not about state payments, it's about what's the big vision.
Yes, which one first?
So a lot of this sounds like the need for a collaborative culture of design to apply the innovation that's there into places. What cities are getting it right just now? So this is it's obviously an aspiration. It's an aspiration for the city. It's an aspiration as a design nation, for example. So who is making retrofit happen on a regular, consistent basis?
Well,
And why is it happening there?
what you guys know better than me, but Manchester, this company called Capital and Centric, which is now expanding to the whole northwest, and has got very strong links with Andy Durham, the mayor of Manchester, and Yorkshire, and blah blah. They are changing the scene down there, and the work they do is absolutely incredible because the social impact and they goes alongside the development they're building, and all of a sudden you've got, out of a multi-story car park, you've got a multi-use space. You've got flats, offices, an art studio, a community hub. They create communities, so they're not just using an empty building. They are solving the housing problem, they are creating communities, they are regenerating areas and things like that. So to me, do that, Dave, is the most incredible example I know of, but you are the experts.
I mean, Manchester is a good example, but it's a good question though from who's doing it from a retrofit point of view correctly, because Manchester is building a lot of new things as well.
Yeah.
It's an interesting one. So Manchester's kind of created a buzz, and it's created an economy, and it's created an open-mindedness that you can build that. So when you get small developers that come in and say, well, this old building here, we can do something really interesting with it, and there's a strong enough market to support that. And it's like any large city like London as well that has a strong economy makes it work well. Yeah, that's a good question.
I would say Berlin. I'm gonna go a bit farther afield here. Sorry, that's because I'm not from here, obviously. I think Berlin.
Berlin.
I think Berlin is good. I think Buenos Aires is having an incredible program of things that are actually dealt in a slightly different model, in that it's not commercially led, it's community led, and it's not happening everywhere, but it's a really interesting way of looking at it, because what you were saying in Manchester and here is all about creating the commercial return. So if you're going to make enough return, then you'll take the risk of changing this building to do something, because you know you have a guaranteed return at the end. But that takes a very strong economy, constantly growing, and how that's not possible just because of lack of movement. So, but there are other places. So Berlin has a really interesting retrofit program, retrofitting most of the east part that was built very much in concrete. Again, the Germans being very German, they have very strict rules about how you do this, and very standardized processes, and it works quite well. They're not very bonny, but they are, they are like very efficient in terms of energy and things. They also have a surplus of housing, which is quite an interesting conundrum in that city. And Buenos Aires has a new whole neighborhood of people just building it for themselves in ruins or buildings that have been derelict for a while. So there's very different approaches here on how do you take the very commercially led that creates an opportunity for smaller developments, the state approach of we need to refurbish this because blah 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 blah, and the kind of community led by that. So I will look out with the UK and see. Paris is doing it too in the buildings, on the very bad buildings of the 80s as well, quite in a at scale. So yeah, lots of different places.
Yeah, Italy tried, and then it will become a very big con where people were making money out of the governments as being stopped and sacked.
That probably happened in Spain too, but I don't know. I wouldn't know.
You had a question as well.
I think my question is a bit of a bold one actually to that more elegant question. Does the panel feel as though the high building focus absolutely takes all the attention away from retrofit? And then from a Manchester perspective, I'm down there enough, I was down there last week, there's a hell of a lot of demo. And for somebody from Glasgow who wants to see preservation of as much as possible, the only real like Glasgow campaign I'm aware of is something to do with high buildings that I don't see any real demand for above like a 2025. That's not high, this is a building for a city. But there's a panel feel that that's almost a policy that's being driven at the moment because it's the only sexy one. And it absolutely makes retrofit even more challenging.
There is policy within general plan policy to look at retrofit and reuse. You do, if you're doing a major application, generally, you have to go through the process of how that building could be reused. Generally though, and from experience as well, when working with clients, they push it as hard to prove that it can't be reused. So it's a little bit cynical to a point. But it's there. Quite rightfully, there maybe does need to be a separate policy that pushes for it. And Glasgow does like a headline policy that they can put out there with minimal effort as well. That perhaps there needs to be a stricter way, and maybe that's an opportunity for Glasgow. Say, what's Glasgow about? Maybe it's about the best place to retrofit and the best place to reuse existing building, because we do have a fantastically beautiful city with really strong architecture and urban design in it that should be reused, and actually should really be a test bed for that. And there's a sort of something exciting to do. So yeah, I think the reporting has been strange about the tall building policy, because it's the media trying to find something exciting to put out there, but actually it was clarifying something
that it was already there.
We were already, and we were talking about this earlier, planning, when you're developing a large building, you do have a lot of pre-application discussions with planning, especially if you're going to do something that's maybe against the grain, so your client pays for that, and you go through a process. We've got the urban design panel as well, where the teams of other designers and people interested in the city, so that is quite strong. But yeah, there is something there, but it could be stronger.
Yeah.
Going back to kind of design there, I think it was touched upon earlier about like understanding the like kind of existing condition of the building before you go forward with like the new design, setting out those new design objectives. Going back to kind of design and stuff, do you think, so it's like early engagement basically with that design team, so looking at your structural team, your fire team, the MEP and services, are you on board with that early engagement? And if so, like, what do you think are the barriers for that early engagement? Because from an engineering perspective, that's what we're hit at, is we don't feel like we're brought in early enough into that conversation. So just a perspective on what you think those barriers are, or whether we need to be brought in earlier.
From my point of view, working in commercial architecture, we can have a client come in on a Monday and say, I'm looking at buying this big building in St Vincent Street. What can we do with it? Can you tell me by Friday? Right. So we have to turn that around really fast, and we're like, well, actually, you're taking this. There's a lot of responsibility if you take on one of these buildings. You're going to have to get your timescales different to make this work, and actually talk to the engineers. So from our point of view as architects, as designers, we need the engagement with engineers from the start, absolutely. But we are in a position where a client just is like, well, sketch something up and tell me what you can do with it, and then I'll buy it, or I won't,
or
sort
not.
of thing. So
And you wanted to buy it because then you want the work.
Yeah. So, but then you're like, well, actually, there's all these challenges in it. They're giving us enough time here, and it's about, that's what I was trying to touch on earlier. It's a re-education piece that more thought is needed, and you need to work slightly slower to go through the process to work out what's there. Because working with an existing building, you need to get into it, and you need to look at it, and you need to understand it, and that all takes time. And time is money, and that's the challenge.
But I think it's a question of steps. There is a first initial step, which is about capacity, say, or constraints that we can see quickly when you have to do these kind of assessments that are like, I need to know, maybe not for Friday, but maybe for next week, and you have a first pass at it. And then we can say, right, and the constraints that I can see here is this, and this. And the majority tend to be engineering things. It will be about how is the structure, how can you ventilate this, and so the earlier then they get, but it's about investment as well. And it's understanding at the step that you have to have. But I don't think I have ever worked in any project that hasn't had engineering input from stage one. Maybe even before that, if we're looking at feasibilities, and I'm just looking at Jim here because we're working on something together right now, and it's a feasibility. So it's very early on, and it has to be meaningful, because the crazy architect can come and say, oh, I'll just do this, I'll make these holes, and normally we kind of know what things are, but we don't know everything, and you kind of have like serious people to tell you, no, this is actually feasible or not. So yeah, early on, very early on.
It's also about retaining information, like open sourcing information, because there's buildings. I can imagine every single building in the city centre has been looked at by someone at some point. Right? So there's been engineers, there's been architects, there's been everyone's looked at them all, but the data's not shared. It's all like, oh, that's mine. There's no sharing of it, so everything always goes back to square one, and
you have to start again.
Mistakes might be made again. And it's is there a way to share information on buildings? You work with BIM models, building information management models, that are supposed to go to the people who are operating a building, and they know which light fitting to fix when it breaks and stuff like that. But could you have that from the city for it to understand, well, that's not actually a steel frame building, it's actually concrete.
It just looks like that.
It just looks like that, and people actually do know lots of interesting things about all the buildings when you meet them, but quite often it all starts again, because you have economic shocks every 5 years in Glasgow, so everything gets lost and you start again, gets lost and starts again. So open sourcing building information could be the way to do that.
Blimey, that's a bit late. Right, I'm aware that we've been talking for an hour, so we have one last question from you guys. No, so let's finish on a high, right? What advice would you give to someone in the audience who wants to champion retrofit in their own practice?
Do it.
That's a bit too simplistic, come on. Don't stop at the first hurdle.
Yeah, it is becoming the norm. It is the norm more and more for what we do. And it is trickling through into everyone's awareness that that's what you do. That's simply where you start. And more people are coming to us with buildings and saying, even though they might be from 2005, it's like, how do we keep this building even though it's falling apart because none of this stuff is stuck on with the right glue or things like that. That's a lot of the challenges. It's actually really interesting, and it is really interesting peeling away a building, whether it's your baronial castle or whether it's a more recent building. It's just always been curious, and it's always just getting involved. And it does require a bit of stubbornness at times, especially in front of clients, to say that. But it's also then educating yourself and understanding what the policies and the legislation is, and how building control would react to something, and how planning would react to something, so you can actually
be ready,
really direct the client towards doing what's the right thing for the city and for buildings and for the environment.
Rob, what do you think?
So it comes back to maybe slightly on the point before, actually a few points perhaps. One is around like this idea of early engagement. I think the advice from my own experience, like you start these processes and you don't necessarily know what you're going to find, and you can start it and it could be a 5-year project, and the brief might change like dramatically through that period. And like there is models now in terms of how we occupy space. I think this is a good example. Like I don't fully understand what the business model is of this environment, but I think like people wouldn't have envisioned it 5 years ago. I don't think, like in terms of like a space in which people come and talk about ideas, and there's a different form of currency that's happening right now of space that didn't exist. So I think like early engagement in regards to whom actually is going to utilize the space, like the community of people around the use. And I think maybe what you're talking about in terms of the Manchester example, like these ideas are coming out of like, they're not coming from design teams necessarily, they're coming from like people who are innovating around the industries they occupy, whether it's food, whether it's digital tech, whatever that is. And there's one thing I think going forward is that rapidity of change will accelerate. So what the sectors are 5 years from now will be even more different. So I think engagement with the users embedded in the design process, I think create better outcomes, and that's like
But sometimes you don't have the user.
No, you don't. But I think
that's okay.
But I think you don't always. But I think like that is definitely not the case. I'm talking very specifically from my background in terms of like the type of work that I've done, which is like very place-based. That's not necessarily receiving architectural briefs. And turning them around in a week. That sounds good. Very impressive. But yeah, you know, so that would be my thing. Like, just I think early engagement, both like with the team, but also ultimately like really like engagement with the users and the people who potentially occupy it.
You are the engaging expert. You do a lot of
that's what I love.
Yeah,
but I think for retrofit and my concept of retrofit is slightly different from Tony.
Well, all three of them.
Everybody has a little. To me, is everything that is just about reuse and reimagine, and you know, insufflate life into things that are dead, really. And how do you do that? Is by adding things on or taking things away. But I think it's almost this that you're constantly pulling these three levers at the same time. On the one hand, you have to know all your technical bits that Tony was talking about, and how all these things are put together and how do they perform. You have to keep that on rein. The other thing you need to put in rein is this ability to take risks and get the client actually interested in there, while you're also juggling this other hat of being a custodian of the buildings and the city. And that's the bit that we do almost without putting it on paper. But you know, I always feel that everything we do as architects or as designers are about making the city that we live better. And I do a lot of engagement, yes, and I don't like doing buildings that are not for a particular user. But I have found that there's users out there, because actually when you're walking through the street, that becomes the background to your life. So it's important, and they are users that are not considered as a stakeholder. So there's these three lines of constantly pulling, being the custodian, knowing all your technical bits, which are quite difficult, and also then keep pushing for this kind of an idea and a thing. And I don't know that you can do that alone. I think in my case, I need a team with me that can push all these things at the same time, because on my own it's impossible. But yeah, that's what I would say. Look at those three things.
Right, Tony, Rob, Anna, thank you. Well done. Please enjoy your drink before you go.